Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Casey Mills, and I'm honored to be the interim president here at PNCA. Welcome to PNCA, and welcome to the 2016 Alfred Edelman Lecture. The lighting's bad, and I can't read my notes, but I will press on. For over 100 years, PNCA has helped shape the region's art and design landscape. PNCA's mission is to prepare students for a life of creative practice. This preparation includes prompting young artists to view the world from wider perspectives and leverage curiosity, passion, and technical acuity to create new and relevant solutions to complex contemporary challenges. Thus, the Edelman Lecture. Portland architect and photographer Alfred Edelman taught three-dimensional design at PNCA. Mr. Edelman challenged his students to consider principles of engineering, kinetics, physics, and other subjects, seemingly dissimilar to art. In so doing, he brought the outside world into his classroom. Established in 1999 by Carol Edelman and family and friends, the Edelman Lecture Series was created to encourage students to look into other subjects seemingly dissimilar to art. In so doing, he wanted to provide students with aha moments of unexpected connections and ideas. For over 16 years, the Edelman Lecture Series has brought incredible speakers and thinkers to PNCA, including scientists, philosophers, performers, musicians, and poets. This has been a remarkable gift to the college. And I wanted to thank Carol and her daughter and my former co-board member and PNCA alum, Jenna Edelman, for this remarkable gift to the college. And so it is with mixed emotions that I have to announce that this is the last year of the lecture. Over the years, Carol and Jenna have watched as PNCA undergraduates curriculum has broadened and deepened. They are now exposed to ideas and perspectives of a wide variety, just as Alfred Edelman would have wanted. This is why the Edelmans have chosen to redirect the lecture fund to a library fund, dedicated to building a collection housed in the PNCA library around a particular theme each year. The Edelman Library Fund will enhance student understanding of the visual world and be a catalyst for a lively discussion in the classroom. Please join me in thanking Carol and Jenna for their leadership and support in making this change happen. So now tonight's Edelman Lecture, Destigmatizing Mental Illness. Tonight it is our honor to host Sheila Hamilton. Following Sheila's talk, she will be joined in conversation by musician and activist Lynn and artist Jennifer Pepin. You will learn more about Logan and Jennifer later, but I wanted to note that in September, on September 23rd, Logan is set to release his 8th album, Adieu, which you were hearing when you entered. Benedict Carey, science reporter for the New York Times, who focuses on brain and behavior topics, will moderate the discussion, and after that, we'll have a Q&A for everyone. But first, Sheila Hamilton. Sheila is a five-time Emmy Award-winning journalist and author of All the Things We Never Knew, Chasing the Chaos of Mental Illness, a memoir about being blindsided by her husband's bipolar disorder and suicide. Sheila's book was awarded a National Gold Award in the 20th Annual Independent Publisher Book Awards. Beginning her career as an associate producer for public broadcasting, Sheila currently is the host of KINK FM Morning Show and was recently voted Oregon's best radio personality. She writes cover stories for About Face magazine and serves on the board of Girls Inc., an organization empowering girls to be strong, smart, and bold, and the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health. She also serves as an advisor to Flawless Foundation, a mental health advisory organization. Somehow we were able to get some time from her tonight. So please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Sheila Hamilton.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I can't quite believe that this day is finally here. When Jenna asked me about this months ago, I was like, that's so far off in the future. And here we are, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for your contribution, everything that you've done to keep Portland wonderful and weird. We love you for it. Since the release of my book, All the Things We Never Knew, I've been traveling around the country, and I've been talking with hundreds of families about mental illness. And as you might expect, many of these conversations are very difficult. I hear about savings wiped out. I hear about dreams dashed. I hear a lot of disappointment and anger about a system that rarely supports our families. But occasionally, I'll have someone come up to my desk and whisper to me, I had depression, and I'm doing fine. And it's those stories that I hold on to, the stories of people that are in recovery. I want to begin tonight by suggesting that what we're doing right here tonight may be the single most important thing we do in eliminating stigma, and that is sharing the stories of our family's mental illness. 1 in 5 of us in this room will suffer from a serious mental illness at some time, and I believe by actually forming a narrative around what that feels like, what it actually does to our families when we are caring for someone with a mental illness, we can begin to break down some of the stereotypes that actually allow stigma to occur. I believe that ending stigma is actually the most powerful civil rights issue of our time. And I think that we can be among the generation that decides to stop saying stigma and call it what it is, discrimination. I want to talk about the 3 most important things that I've learned in the 10 years since I've been researching and writing about mental health, and they include there's no us versus them when it comes to mental health. It is all of us. We're all along a continuum of health from wellness to illness. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about how we can be more mindful of exactly where we are on the continuum. I also want to advocate for a more holistic and integrated approach to care, because we must stop re-traumatizing the people who are seeking out care, or our rate of suicide will continue to climb. I want to talk a lot about recovery tonight, because I believe that we as human beings have an obligation to people who are suffering to say, I'm going to be with you in this darkest hour, and I believe in your ability to recover. I'm going to stay with you until you do. I want to first take you back so that you understand my story to the worst night of my life, December 13th of 2006. It was snowing outside, and you know how rare it is in winter for the kids when it's snowing. Everybody goes outside and they're sledding. But my daughter and I hadn't been participating because we were stuck in a strange state of limbo. My husband had disappeared the morning after he was released from psychiatric care. I'm going to read now from page 205. Snow fell hard and heavy in November. From time to time, I would talk to the officer from Clackamas County who'd run the search for David, and she'd give me an update. More than a foot of snow in the gorge, she'd say, then 2 feet, and then 3. Normally, Portland doesn't get much snow. It was one of the heaviest winters we'd had in decades. One evening, I awoke from a night terror, my heart beating wildly and sweat covering my body. I dreamed of David, lost in the wilderness, barefoot, looking for his Columbia jacket. My pillow was drenched with tears. I knew then that we would find his body. It was supposed to snow the day I told Sophie I would prepare her favorite meal of crab cakes and risotto for her and our friends, the Wilsons. We'd planned the meal at Colin's home since I hadn't even begun to decorate for Christmas. Sophie helped smash the crab and mush the cornmeal. We stirred rice and assembled crackers and cheese on big plates. After dinner, we made a huge fire in Colin's living room, and Sophie snuggled next to me on the couch. Maddie sat on the other side of the room with her parents and her sister Gemma, who was lounging on a long, elegant chaise. Colin, who'd been washing dishes, stepped into the room, the color drained from his face. "What is it?" I said. "What's happened?" Colin motioned to me to come to the phone. "Take this," he said. "It's important." When we were out of Sophie's earshot, Colin put the phone to his chest and said, "They found him." I felt my body collapse, the weight of the months falling in on me. He held my arm as I stumbled to the study. "No, not now," I thought. "Sophie is so happy tonight." I raised the phone, and a man spoke. "Ms. Hamilton," the voice said. "Yes," I whispered. "We had a volunteer search team on the mountain tonight. It seems like we've been over that place 100 times before." I was half hearing the words. The voice seemed distant, distorted, too slow, like a tape played at a quarter speed. It felt like it was pulling me down into quicksand. We started back at the house and did a grid search, and this is so hard to say, so hard to tell you, but we found David. My fingers loosened around the phone. I was going to drop it, dropped to my knees. I held on, forcing myself to listen, forcing the reality I'd known for so many weeks to crash down on me. "I'm very sorry." Where was he? I don't know how I formed those words. A tremor ran through my body. My legs and arms began to shake. Colin's study was the old Episcopal church office, cold tile and a high ceiling. The windows were frosted. I could feel my body freezing from the inside. Colin stood by me, rubbing my back. The blood stopped pumping to my extremities. My fingers felt white, frostbitten. The voice continued. "He was about 500 yards north of the house, ma'am, in a heavily wooded area. I don't know how we missed it before. One of my officers said he'd walked right through that spot a dozen times before, but there he was, sitting right up against a tree, with his legs crossed." I wanted to stop him, to say, "Please slow down. It's too much all at once." But this was his trauma too now, a total stranger and I, bound by a senseless death. I thought I was ready for this call, that 6 weeks had prepared me for the inevitable, but I was not. "And can I tell you something?" the officer said. "I've come across a lot of suicides in this territory. For some reason, this is the place people come to when they want it over. But this was different." He looked so calm, peaceful. Really, I'm not just saying that, ma'am. He looked like he was at peace. He was looking out at a valley, and he looked like he'd been there for a long time before he died. My fingers went limp around the phone. The will that had held me up during the conversation was gone. I could not hear anymore. I could not manage the details of how he died by suicide, or why the dogs missed a man's frozen body 500 yards from where the search had began. I could not ask him all the questions the reporter in me would have asked. What was the caliber of the gun? Was his body decomposed? Was there any sign of foul play? I whispered thank you and shoved the phone into Colin's hand. "Take this. Please take this." Colin said something. I turned and walked away. I didn't want to hear what it was I was supposed to do next, where they would take him, what kind of responsibility I had to the police department or the coroner or the dozens of people who had aided in this search. I watched myself walk back into the living room where Sophie and Maddie's family were talking in low, worried tones. And I watched myself sit down next to Sophie, grabbing her small hands to make sure she wouldn't run screaming into the night. She looked closely at my face, and her eyes widened. Her slender legs were covered with tights that were the color of the snow. Her long blonde hair was pulled back with a red ribbon. I noticed this because David loved her hair that way, out of her face, away from her pretty eyes and her lips that looked like a perfect heart. She moved her face closer to mine, and she tightened the grip on my hands until the blood left them. I spoke slowly, so I would not babble, so I would not make her more fearful than she already was. The hardest part was hers to bear now. I tried to calm the tremor moving through my body so that I could tell her correctly, tell her the unthinkable. "Remember when I told you that it would be better if we knew, one way or the other, what had happened to Daddy?" Her face tightened, her eyes becoming wildly alert, as if she might bolt from my grasp away from me. She interrupted, already knowing, already crushed. "What, Mama? What?" They were the most dreaded words of my lifetime, and I knew I had no choice but to tell the truth. "They found him, sweetheart, and he's dead. I'm so sorry, baby." I put my arms around her, holding her deep in my chest, trying desperately to cushion this blow. Her body fell into mine, a moment I knew I would have to replay again and again in my lifetime, a memory seared into my brain deeper than the deepest grief I knew. the shuttle exploding, the Twin Towers falling, all of the images of innocence lost I had ever seen, and now this too. Sophie held my waist, her face buried in my chest. I had never heard a child's heart breaking. It is a sound so unforgiving, I knew I would never stop hearing it. It would ring through my memory at exactly the same pitch, with the same intensity, reminding me of the crippling of her heart. The deep, grieving wail she let out echoed through our home, into the street, interrupting the silence of the falling snow. Before that night, I knew only this about suicide, that it was something terrible, that it was something that brilliant scientists and poets and artists did. I'd heard terrible stories of other people's losses. I knew someone who I thought might have known someone who died by suicide, but now I actually loved someone who died by suicide. And before David's death, I thought it had nothing to do with us. I'd learned the hard way that mental illness doesn't discriminate, and now I knew that suicide was similar. I didn't believe that I could live in a world where middle-aged men felt so hopeless against an illness that they would leave their children behind. I had not yet learned the information that we are losing 22 veterans a day to suicide. I didn't want to be introduced to the world where children were cyberbullied into taking their own lives. And I had not yet sat with the parents of teenagers in Palo Alto who were wondering why their sons and daughters were throwing themselves in front of high-speed trains. But now I know the grief, and I know the denial, and I know the anger of being a survivor. And I know how it feels to be left with unanswerable questions and unsolvable paradoxes. And if you're a survivor, you know the obsession that we have with this word, why? Why, on the one hand, do we engage in an almost desperate attempt to forestall our own mortality, and then on the other hand, love someone who chooses death over life? And what could be causing our suicide rate to increase when deaths from other chronic illnesses are decreasing? Deaths from heart disease and cancer and diabetes are all on the decline. And yet this is the 11th year in a row that we've seen an increase in the suicide rate. And when will we finally understand that it is our attachment to shame and stigma that surrounds mental illness that is actually deepening and worsening for the people who suffer this disorder? It's a good thing that I'm a reporter because I'm trained to ask these questions, who, what, where, when, why. But I might actually never have shared my research or any of my story if I hadn't started doing the numbers about the millions of people impacted. There were 43,000 deaths by suicide last year, and the American Association of Suicidology says that for every one death, there are 25 attempts. That's more than 1 million people attempting or dying by suicide every year. And pathologists will tell you that many suicides are unreported. They're claimed as car wrecks or accidental overdoses. So the numbers are staggering. Just this year, the CDC has said that our suicide rate is the highest it's been in the past 3 decades. Our overall rate of suicide has risen 24% for middle-aged men. It's 43%. 43% for men who are ages 45 to 64 in just the last decade. And even more startling to me is that women in the same age range saw a 63% increase in their suicide rates. And I believe we're only going to impact this rate if we begin to actually treat this as the public health crisis that it is. We've got to remind people suicide is preventable, and we must offer immediate help and counseling in every community in America because it is a public health crisis. 278 people are helped through suicidal ideation for every one person that takes his life. My goal as a reporter who is really interested in this topic is to pay attention to those stories of hope and help and recovery. In the aftermath of my husband's death, I was writing as a way out of my own trauma. I wanted to understand his decision and to hold myself accountable for missing early signs and symptoms of his illness. But I would type and I would lie on the floor with my big yellow lab and sob for hours. And in this very unrelenting state of grief, what I noticed was my own fragile state of mind. There's this us versus them mentality when it comes to mental illness, but it's not us versus them. Trauma is at the root of most major mental illness. And with enough trauma, with enough loss, with enough violence, with enough heartache, with neglect, with poor diet, with the kind of chronic stress we live with every day, every one of us could be moved over from the wellness category to the illness category. What do we do to make sure that we can buffer ourselves when these traumas occur? I learned some things, and thankfully, I learned them in a way that really helped me survive the last 10 years. Mindfulness and meditation allow healing at the deepest level of our brains. And I know mindfulness can get a bad rap. People say that it's just becoming, something that everyone does. But for me, it really allowed me to start to observe my thoughts and the way in which I talk to myself, instead of being victim to my own thoughts. Sleep is so crucial to people who are suffering from chronic stress that the first treatment in psychiatric care is often just to let that patient go to sleep for a few days. Movement, faith, strong relationships, talk therapy, yoga, dance, exercise, art, especially art. Owning a pet, making music, listening to music. There is now substantial data to suggest there's good medicine beyond the pharmacy. It sounds so simple, but what is good for your body and your spirit is also really good for your mind. And we must all learn how to seek out those experiences. There have been so many incredible advancements in psychopharmaceuticals, but we've got to acknowledge mental illness is a crisis of our minds, of our bodies, and of our spirits. In many ways, it's a crisis of faith, and we must insist on a holistic and integrated approach to our health and our illnesses. We've got to learn these coping strategies before crisis hits. I really would hope that tonight you could walk away stopping one of the most harmful misconceptions about suicide, and that is that people want to die. That is simply not true. People don't want to die. They just want their pain to be over. In study after study after study, people who are thwarted from suicides and who go on to live can often live very fruitful lives. In the most extensive study, done with 700 people by a professor out of Berkeley University, they found that 90% went on to live wonderful, healthy lives. I want to tell you a little bit more about my husband because I think it's unfair to frame him as his illness, to frame him as the last moment of his life. He was a builder, a designer, and a guy who could name every plant and every tree on the forest path behind our home. He had a massively productive green thumb. He knew where all the best chanterelles were along Highway 26, and believe you, he wouldn't want me to tell you where those hiding spots are. He grew up in the Canadian forests, and he had the strength of a logger and the intellect of his Harvard-educated father. When he was stressed out, he'd chop wood. He never watched TV, but he read 3 books a week. And I was a reporter for the ABC affiliate when I first met David. I ducked into the coffee shop to find him, and it was as if everything around him was electrified. He was 6'4" and had thick brown hair, and his blue eyes just completely captivated me. He was juggling a briefcase and a coffee cup in his mouth, and when he began to talk, I couldn't tell if he was really interested in meeting me or he didn't care at all. And believe me, that actually propelled me further. Writer Mary Karr has said to me that she believes people with mental illness just suffer from the malady of too much bandwidth. And I love that. I love that description. And I've often wondered if David knew his vulnerability. I'll never know, because his family believed that mental illness was a weakness of self, and they raised him to believe that. When other family members suffered from deep depressions or suicide attempts, they circled the wagon, communication stopped, and they let stigma take over. I've only really begun to figure out the extent of the family trauma in David's family, but the worst part of his illness was when David was in rapid cycling and this deeply stubborn psychosis that wouldn't lift, and he reported to a psychiatrist that it was he who was to blame for the rotting of his brain. Our panel tonight is going to talk about how we can reduce stigma and begin viewing mental illness with the same compassion and care as we view physical illness. But I want to introduce you to something that's even more disastrous than this public stigmatizing we do, and that is self-stigmatizing. To experience self-stigma, the person's got to be aware that this stereotype is out there, and then they've got to believe it. For David, He believed that people with mental illness were to blame for their disorder, and then he agreed with that assessment. I brought this on myself. I was so ignorant about the signs and symptoms of bipolar disorder because 10 years ago, this disorder wasn't talked about very much. It's a mood disorder. And because David was so highly functioning, he baffled most of his doctors. Even though bipolar disorder shares a lot of similarities to physical diseases, these illnesses with behavioral components destroy more than one individual. The qualities that he showed of rage and despair and duplicity and promiscuity and unpredictability were all a part of his illness. But because David denied that he had a mental health problem, I thought he was just being a jerk. Many people who care for loved ones who have mental illness tell me the same thing. They struggle with this question: where does the self end and the illness begin, or vice versa? And why are the worst behaviors of my loved one directed at me? Few people realize the toll that mental illness can have on a marriage, in anger and resentment and sexual infidelity and hopelessness. But because of his intellect, David managed to compensate for his illness for nearly 4 decades. As David got older, the jobs that he took became more complicated and his cognitive functioning was declining, and he became easily confused and oddly disorganized. He said that the penchant he had for holding things together was slipping through his fingers. He then became frozen, unable and unwilling to even bill his many clients at the design firm he owned. And when I prodded around the edges of his behaviors, he seemed to explode in a way that was wholly uncharacteristic. When David finally asked for help, he was misdiagnosed. He went to a doctor friend who prescribed him antidepressants, and within 48 hours of taking those antidepressants, he told me that he was hearing voices telling him to jump from the Vista Bridge. SSRIs have helped millions of people, but for people with bipolar disorder, they can be extremely dangerous, and David was forced into his first manic episode. He never really recovered. He lost 20 pounds in a month. He paced at all hours of the night. He was so paranoid and so agitated that he told me it was as if he was living with a demonic force inside him. And our interaction with the mental health system isn't at all unique. David refused to be hospitalized, and he was so bright and charming when he spoke to doctors that they refused to hospitalize him. He didn't appear to be a risk to himself or others. There was nothing our family could do at that point to convince him to seek more intensive care. And I'm advocating for a more reasonable middle ground between protecting the right of psychiatric patients to remain free and protecting the right of both the patient and the family to be protected from the tragic effects of a worsening illness. David's rights were intact for a couple of more weeks, but in that time he made 2 suicide attempts and he was finally hospitalized. There, the nurses worked behind bulletproof glass. His doctor only saw him for 15 minutes a day to adjust his medication, and I visited him once to find him so pumped full of antipsychotics he was catatonic, his eyes darting back and forth. I don't know how long he'd sat there on the couch, frozen. Psychopharmacology is a very inexact science, and often we don't really know why one drug works really well for one person and not so much for the other. But David said the insistence on drugs alone made him feel like he was a lab rat. The mental health system that we were trusting was rewarding doctors for bringing people through the door, but not for outcomes. Now, can you imagine a heart surgeon whose number of successful surgeries or deaths wasn't a factor in whether or not you went to them as your care? We were advised that David would probably never get better and that he would never be able to actually run his business again. They told him that he might want to actually consider giving up his parental rights of Sophie. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm definitely not a physician. I'm a wife and a mother who would desperately like to change the mental health system. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for families, we know this, but we must demand a mental health system that engages individuals by where they are in their illness and a system that gives them brighter hope for the future. We've got to stop this re-traumatization of people who are seeking out care. We must actively engage every patient with a promise of recovery, and we should hold our psychiatrists and our psychologists and our therapists to the same standard that we hold other doctors in the health system. David's care team had no idea that the day after he was released, he died by suicide. There was no system of tracking his care or his outcome. A holistic and integrated approach to mental health crises is far more effective than drugs alone. And many other countries that have begun to actually gather data on things like dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, somatosensory activities are finding that combined with small doses of medication, we're going to get better outcomes. Our brains get sick, but they can also get better. And part of the healing is the power of emotional attachments, of having one person who says, I'll be here for you. I wanted my story to be the antidote to David's shame and the silence and the stigma his family felt. I want it to be open and honest and vulnerable. But mostly, I wanted to frame David's life in love and provide an accounting of this brilliant, beautiful man. I've been really blessed to get some great reviews, but the best review that I got was when my daughter finally read this last year on a family vacation. We were traveling in an airplane to France, and she finally opened the manuscript and began reading, and I watched as tears streamed down her face. And she would close the book and take deep breaths and then begin again. And when she closed the book for good, she said, Mom, you got it exactly right. Sophie's willingness to accept things as they were and move forward was a large part of the reason I'm here today. She and a legion of other young advocates are wholly unwilling to accept discrimination against people who are suffering. This summer, Sophie's going to return as a Donald Kennedy Fellow from Stanford University, and she'll be organizing a peer outreach team at Unity Behavioral Health Center. Sophie has come full circle from being a person who might have been seen as victimized to a person who says, hell no. We should be learning from the mechanisms of the Sophies of the world, bouncing forward from our trauma and loss, because on average in our lifetimes, each of us is going to experience 4 to 5 of these traumas. And there's substantial research to show that if we go through trauma and learn from it, we can rewire our brains to be more open, more empathetic, more compassionate, and helpful. And in writing my story and sharing my truth, I wanted to counter the narrative of diminishment and of humiliation and loss. In a sense, I wanted to hold myself accountable to all of the light. I borrowed heavily from a lot of other people who have come to this place of healing, among those the brilliant psychoanalyst Kay Redfield Jamison, who also suffers from bipolar disorder. She really helped me understand the futility of David's illness. And in doing that, I was able to finally forgive David for his choice. And a funny thing happened when I finally forgave David. I forgave myself. So I'm going to leave you tonight with this thought. When you walk out of here, why don't we banish the word stigma? Let's call it what it is. Let's call it discrimination and prejudice. And let's begin holding the people who are suffering as close as we might hold them if they are dying of cancer. Let's look to the living and love them and hold on. Thank you.
Let's all take a breath. That was something else. I'm Ben Carey. I'm a New York Times reporter. I cover mental health issues, and I'm very delighted to be here for many reasons. I thank the Edelmans and Sheila and the other guests we're going to bring up, and we're going to talk briefly about stigma and some other things I think that will be really interesting concerning mental health. So Sheila, I'm going to ask you to come up and sit down. She's going to be joined by 2 others, Jennifer Pepin. Jennifer, why don't you come on up? And Logan Lynn. Come on up, Logan. I'm going to tell you a little bit about both of them quickly. Go to the glasses, as they say. Jennifer's an artist and also the owner of the Pepin Art Gallery, which is here in the Pearl District, close by. You should talk to her and find out where and visit. It's an unusual and somewhat striking place, I'm told, in that Jennifer is displaying art by people with mental illness. You know, a lot of institutions have residents do art, and usually no one really sees it. Anyway, Jennifer's making an effort to put some of those pieces on display, so I think it's definitely worth looking. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her. She opened the gallery 2.5 years ago after being faced with stigma and misunderstanding in her own life. She has bipolar disorder. And she recently received the Pathfinder Business Award from NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, and a Mental Health Hero Award from the Trillium Family Services, which is a behavioral health provider here. So that's Jennifer. Logan Lynn, sitting next door there, is, as you heard, some of his latest album called Adieu playing when you walked in. Logan's a musician, also a writer, a producer, a television personality, and an activist. He's the former host of New Now Next on MTV's Logo Network, and he's the brainchild behind the Keep Oregon Well campaign to fight the stigma of mental health through music and the arts. You might have seen them outside the door there with t-shirts and so on. Lynn currently serves as the Chief Communications Officer for Trillium Family Services, Oregon's largest provider of mental and behavioral health care for children and families. And Adieu is his 8th album. All right. So we've got about a half hour. We have 3 people here who can talk about mental health illness stuff really from the inside, okay? It just makes these kind of conversations really interesting. I'm going to ask them a few questions, and I'm going to sit down over there so this looks more like a conversation. And since we are talking about stigma, I'll start with that. I will say, as a reporter and journalist person writing about this, I feel this is actually a great time to address stigma, maybe retire the word. Young people especially are very tolerant now. The world is changing very quickly. They tolerate all sorts of difference, and racial and gender-wise and all this. And I think a lot of mental health terminology has entered the sort of lingua franca, into the popular culture, partly because of drug advertising, by the way. So I think that we become more familiar with mental health issues, much more so than a generation ago. But there's still a long way to go, of course, and I want to ask each of you guys what you think, and Logan's already doing something, you guys are all doing your own part on this, what you think really would be a practical, creative way to I guess, reduce stigma is one way to put it, but I think just to get it so that people who have had a mental illness, or have one, are not that ashamed about talking about it. So why don't I start with Logan over there?
Sure.
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I'm also an LGBTQ activist, and I think part of the success for that community, my community, becoming empowered or regaining the power that had been taken from us, was the process of actually coming out, right? Standing up in your own home, in your own neighborhood, in your own community, saying, I'm Logan, I'm gay. And so I've really, with Keep Oregon Well, and I would actually encourage you all to sign that pledge to fight stigma after we leave here tonight. We would love for you to join us in that effort. But the idea was to create a platform where people could really stand up and be themselves publicly, talk about their illness, have language for things that potentially feel unspeakable at times. And so, I started that campaign myself, by coming out myself. I'm a survivor of sexual assault as a child. I have PTSD, I have persistent suicidal ideation as an adult, and I also am really successful and thriving. Both of those things are true for me. And so we've really been identifying heroes who are doing things similarly. Both of these two talented people on the stage here with us are former and current Keep Oregon Well mental health heroes. And I think the more of us that stand up and say, this is who I am, this is my truth, and it's normal, the more we sort of collectively find our power again.
All right, Jennifer, what do you say? What do you think?
I would completely agree with that. I think that one of the things that's been successful about the gallery is that we have the artists write their stories next to their artwork. And what I've witnessed is people who have come in and read the story, who have maybe been faced with their own stigma, start to break that down and start to open up, and they kind of have found a safety network where they can open up and feel better about themselves. I also think that, one of the things is to believe, act, live, breathe like any other person just because you have a diagnosis. So we really believe, artist first, diagnosis second.
Sheila, one thing I picked up on your talk is about the continuum. I mean, my approach to this is because, I'm Irish, so in the DNA, we're all freaking crazy. So I feel like
that means you'd be my first boyfriend.
The idea is that, she talked about the continuum, meaning that, look, a lot of these mental illnesses are sort of extreme, on the extreme end of things that all of us experience. And I think that offers an opportunity to basically move people into, to just moving people into normal. In other words, these are familiar emotions that have become hard to manage, ones that everybody knows about. And anyway, so that's one of the things I took away from your talk. But talk about that a little bit more.
I had the experience of meeting Kristen Bell, and she's the wonderful actress. You probably know her. She's beautiful, petite. And when I met her, I was so struck by her empathy and her kindness and this quality that she radiated that I really couldn't put my finger on. Just this week, Kristen has come out, as Logan says, and told the press that she suffers from severe anxiety, severe depression, and suicidal thoughts. I believe that if we started talking about the reason that mental illness sometimes gives us the bandwidth that Mary Carr described, where, yes, I might also have anxiety, but I also have extraordinary sensitivity. I also have the ability to walk into a room and know what every single person in this room is thinking and feeling. I think if we talked more about the good qualities that come from these particular type of brains, we could eliminate a lot of the stigma that's out there.
Oh, that's great. I think the autism community is one that's really done a little bit of that. In other words, saying, we're special, we're other-oriented.
Right.
Gives us these extra qualities, and that sort of amazing how that has really entered the conversation about autism. One thing I think is really helpful in making this all happen and useful for people, whether you have a mental diagnosis or not, is knowing how to handle these extremes of emotions, because we all have them. And I think people who deal with very extreme versions, Jennifer, for example, anyone with bipolar or depression or severe anxiety, of course, they have to figure out how to manage that. And so in a way, they become experts in managing these very difficult emotions. Experts who can tell the rest of us, give us some good advice about how stuff to experiment with. Because in the end, you really have to discover your own treatment program. So one question I have for all of you, and I'll start with Jennifer this time, is about how art, creative activities, you name it, writing, music, sculpture, whatever you're doing, how specifically it can help. I mean, we all think, it seems right that it helps and it's creative and all that, but I wonder if you can describe any specific things that you do, or even you do in the gallery, that help you literally manage, sort of a gust of emotion that's coming.
Yeah, I definitely think that a holistic process to managing is really important. So there's the medicine portion, there's the mindfulness portion, and then there's definitely the creative portion, whether it's music, writing, painting. I didn't really realize the connection between my painting and my bipolar until actually several years into my diagnosis, and then I started to look at the patterns of my moods, and then also discovering, kind of how that played a role with my art. I think that it provides a voice when you may not be able to express yourself in other ways. For me, it also allows me to kind of channel my thoughts when, a lot of times when hypomanic, you have racing thoughts, and it kind of gives me that meditative position to really, just kind of focus on the paintbrush. And so I would say that those are probably the two biggest things. I know that in the gallery, everybody would talk about how it's somehow therapeutic for them.
So when you're concentrating on the painting, it sort of settles down the racing part.
Right.
Okay.
It's like those coloring books that are really popular right now.
Yeah.
I love them. I love it.
Logan, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's art or music or whatever it is that I'm doing at any given time to kind of get the poison out is really, for years now, been the only way that I can really effectively do that. I got signed first when I was 17, and this record that's coming out in September is about mental health, my own survival through grief and suffering and trauma, and it is a pop record. It doesn't sound super lighthearted, but it actually is also a fun record about love and hope and resilience, and I think for me, back to the sort of unspeakable stuff, when I was young, the things that I was writing about were about how on drugs I was. I'm 8 years clean from a 16-year crippling addiction to alcohol and cocaine and crack cocaine, which I was self-medicating my trauma with. It's been a busy 8 years. But I feel like, I've always been I've always been singing about it. It's changed now that I'm healed or healing or recovering, in that I feel more in control of my narrative, but I was always putting it out there like this. I think that the thing that's interesting is the way it's received now. When I was a sort of a wild party boy rock and roll guy, everybody was clapping for those narratives, and as soon as I started being like, I'm healing and I'm gonna talk about the same thing but sort of the other side of the coin, then suddenly there was this resistance, and I think it's curious, right? Like what would you have done with Amy Winehouse if her song was "I'm gonna go to rehab"? It's a different thing, and I think that those of us that are exploring those themes are sort of on the front line of changing that. I would love to change that rock and roll stereotype to be looking like a person in a black leather jacket who's also here with his family and who also has a home to go to after this. So,
yeah, I think we prefer the broken rock and rollers to the healed kind.
It's played out.
But when you write a song about whatever, about the trauma or about you're getting the poison out, I mean, do you literally feel a release of the sensation in your body?
I would say so. Yeah, I mean, this record was. I sing into my phone, or I scream into my phone, or I cry. I dug through 500 different voice notes on my phone, a lot of which were incoherent babbling, and some of which were melodic, and I pieced that together into arrangements. On the record, I actually ended up keeping some of those original recordings of me screaming or crying, because I felt like. Even though historically I might have thought those were throwaways, they actually really captured a moment of healing for me. It was the moment I found voice to this unspeakable truth, and so yeah, we put that in the mix.
That's great, and I suspect that you too, writing the book. I mean, is it writing prose that you feel had that practical effect of sort of getting through this?
Definitely, I felt like I gave voice to the sorrow and confusion I couldn't actually explain to anyone else. And in many ways, I felt like the book moved through me. I've heard other writers say that before, and I've never had that experience, especially under deadline as a reporter. You're like, oh God, I can't find my next word. But this book really moved through me in a way. And I was using this beautiful tree outside my office as my kind of symbol for life, because it was broken from that ice storm the year that David died. It was battered and it looked like it wasn't going to survive, and I really saw it as a template for myself of just rooting down and kind of going dormant to the sadness of the world and exploring that deep, deep emotional process. And sure enough, that spring the tree had buds and I was beginning to come from it, and it was a beautiful process. I tear up even thinking about it because it was so emotional, but it was also one of the most profound years of my life.
That's great. I remember writing a story about Edvard Munch, the painter. And there's this whole cottage industry among psychiatrists and of diagnosing people, artists and so on that are long dead. And someone had done this with Munch, saying he was bipolar. And so I went to the editor and said, I'm thinking about doing this, but Munch, he's all the paintings that he did after The Scream, which is his famous painting like this, he was healed and recovered. My editor said to me, The Scream's the only one anyone remembers. I mean, so there's an interesting, back and forth about madness and art. And I think that the two can serve each other a little bit, but you certainly need the discipline to carry out the art in the end. I have another question that I am curious about, and also I think is a practical interest, which is, about the mental health care system. It's a big word, it's a big system all over the place. It has lots of different players, insurers and drug companies and therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. And it's so confusing. And there's real trust issues for everyone when you engage the system. And I think the people that I know through my job who have had severe illness and have figured out how to cope have all been able to discover their own treatment, whatever that is. So it often includes stuff these guys just talk about. But it also includes what we think of as traditional therapy, psychotherapy, and often medication, not always. But they had to learn how to navigate this system. So I'm going to ask you about that, because I think, I guess I know that all of you have done that somewhat. And like I say, it's very complicated. You don't know where to start. But I mean, why don't we, actually, why don't I start with Sheila this time? I mean, you say you knew nothing about bipolar disorder. You figured that out after the death. What can you advise in terms of engaging the system? You were talking about how he was sort of comatose on antipsychotic drugs. I mean, you were describing very clearly a failure of the traditional system. I mean, what would you advise people now who want to say, look, I have a kid or my husband or myself, and I need to plug in and get help?
Well, first of all, part of the way I structured the book was because I wrote this memoir, right? It's this personal experience, but I also have this reporter in me. And so I did a ton of research about where actually you can go the moment you're in crisis, from county to county, to place. I have a directory for people. I have all the different types of therapies sandwiched between every chapter. So it's a wonderful resource for families in crisis. But I also think people underutilize some places that I'm going to give a shout out to tonight because they're doing extraordinary work. And one is the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care. It's a group of psychiatrists, psychologists, funders who believe in a more integrated approach to care. And what they have said is, if we can help you actually be almost like a person who comes and they're your concierge through the mental health system, we can put you in touch with people who believe like we do. Because one of the hardest things for family is to get caught with a psychiatrist who's like, that yoga is poppycock. You don't want to do that yoga, just take these drugs. And there's a lot of them left. And so I think going to these organizations that say, we believe in integrated care, we believe in it, the science is there, is a good place to start. I would back it up even further in that I think we should be doing this kind of curriculum for toddlers and people in 4, 5, 6 age range. I think they need to learn emotional regulation. I think they need to understand things like somatosensory activities early so that they begin self-regulating. So part of my advocacy now is how do we get a curriculum that actually puts our mental health on par with our SAT scores? I really think it's very important.
So is the takeaway that we want to give toddlers antipsychotics? Is that it? Okay. That's great. Jennifer, I want to hear from you absolutely on this, because you made a reference to finding right medication and stuff. So I mean, you've had to do this, it sounds like. Yeah. So talk about that for a second. How did you figure out the right combination?
I think that, first of all, it's, as you spoke about earlier, kind of trust. So I actually went through several therapists before I found somebody that I felt was compatible. So I think one of my recommendations is don't be afraid to find somebody that feels like a good fit. that you can be honest with. Because that was, for me, the biggest key, being honest about my moods, about physical feelings, mental feelings, because so many people react so differently to various medications that if you're not honest, your doctor can't properly prescribe that.
Well, how did you find the therapist, though? I mean, how did you actually do it?
I did it actually through references. So found somebody that had a good experience with a therapist, and then got that referral.
Word of mouth, basically. Yeah. And then you knew quickly when the therapist wasn't right for you.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And how long did that take for those therapists?
Well, I made a transition from California to Portland. So initially it took me a few months in San Francisco, and then after moving here, it took me a little while again. But not so long that you start feeling like it's unattainable.
And how much sort of the medication of trying those before you could figure out that this was right, whatever it is? Yeah.
The medication piece is something that's constantly changing, to be honest. I was on the same medication for years and actually recently had to change. But my advice would be don't get discouraged, because you will find the right balance of medication to help. And there is that support out there, and there are other tools while you're going through that process to help you get through that process.
Okay. Now, Logan, you started with, it sounds like, bourbon and cocaine as your medications of choice. Yeah. I can't remember what diagnosis those are for. My family takes a lot of them. I know that. Tell me how you sort of managed to find a combination of things, in the system that helped you.
Yeah, I mean, that's ongoing, I would say. I've been a consumer of mental health services for as long as I can remember. When I was young, I was raised in a church, and so the first counselor I went to see was not very affirming. It wasn't a church that loved the gays. So the counselor also was kind of in that headspace. So I had a bad taste in my mouth right off the bat from just early childhood, sort of teenage experiences. But I went to rehab a bunch of different times. My parents loved me enough to just keep sending me over and over. And, eventually I met somebody the last stint after I was an adult. I had had a partial stroke and was really having to put my life back together. It was the end of the line for me. But I met somebody there in this last stint, which lasted about a year, inpatient, outpatient therapy, all of that. And that was 2008. Met this man who said, "Why are you using? What's going on? What has happened to you?" Versus every other time they had been go to 90 meetings in 90 days, you'll be fine, just stop doing drugs. And so this person really helped me kind of get to the root of what I was masking, why I didn't just wake up and decide to be a drug addict one day. I didn't just wake up and decide to be homeless and put my parents through hell. All of that stuff was given to me by the trauma that had been bestowed upon me at the age of 7. And it took that many years of in and out to really figure out what I needed. And that did end up looking like a combination of medication and talk therapy and art and time away to sort of reset the clock and reconnect with my family and my friends. And it was all of it. It wouldn't have worked if I had just taken a pill. It wouldn't have worked if I had just locked myself in a safe room. It was really the ecosystem of wellness that I had created.
That's great. Those are all the questions I have. I hope they were interesting too. If anyone has questions for these guys, now's the time. Come on up to the microphone if you like. One thing I struck by all three answers here is that it sounds like there's this importance in having this one alliance with somebody who gets what's happening. And that can be hard to find, often because the person themselves doesn't know and they're confused too. Go ahead.
Hello, thanks everybody for sharing your stories and your honest opinions on all of this. I know it's a complicated topic and we appreciate it. My name is David. I know Jennifer from the gallery. Go check it out. It's pretty awesome. I suffer with bipolar myself. I'm finding ways to cope and deal with it. My question is mainly for Sheila, but then you had also mentioned about the church and how this whole topic with church and faith and mental illness kind of can live together, since they do and should. I'm a pastor's son, and the crisis of faith is something that I've dealt with and been a huge part of my depression. You know, where is God in the suffering? It's a common question we all ask. So how can you talk about the relationship with the church and maybe bringing the stigma down in the religious environment?
I've been really so pleased to have churches ask me to come speak. I know that I think mental illness is kind of the last taboo, to tell you the truth. It's the one thing that people, even a pastor will say, is it okay to talk about, even though he's actually giving counsel to 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of his parishioners or his people who are coming to him. And so what I have said is if we can actually do kind of a ground up movement where everybody who is in a church does the kind of thing that I like to do, which is to say, why don't we have this topic? Why don't we actually bring this up as a church? I don't know if you do that, but a lot of like Unitarian Presbyterians do, where they ask people, what are you interested in? I think if every one of us could become an advocate for mental health as a topic in our lives, that we could actually change it even within churches. They've been very open when I come speak, and the stories afterwards of how ashamed people are are really so difficult to hear, because one would think they're in this beautiful, supportive environment, but there's still way too much silence and discrimination in churches, for sure.
Yeah, I would just add that, I think saying church is loaded, right? In that my experience of church is probably vastly different than yours. My experience as a preacher's kid is probably vastly different than your experience as a preacher's kid. So I try to be really specific about what church we're talking about when we talk about churches. But for me, your question, I really believe, in love, and if God is love, then I believe in God, I guess, too. That's a really hard sentence for me to say, but I really believe in love, and I believe that I have found the love in my life at those times where I've been sort of in the midst of suffering, or I'm coming out of suffering, and so that love, that God was in the suffering with me too. I think that's been really good for me to, even though there was almost 2 decades where I couldn't feel the love that was being given to me, once I came out of my sickness, once I was healed enough to start feeling that, all of that had been given to me that whole time was still there. It had just been sort of buried. So I felt like I had a God-shaped hole in my heart, and I actually didn't. I had like a sort of a love filter that once I removed that filter, I was filled up again. Does that make sense?
Thank
Can
you.
I say one thing? In regard to what you said, where is God with all this? And then kind of what you said earlier about feeling special. And I think I had a friend, I had one of those moments, like, why me? Why are you doing this to me? And a friend said to me, look at how you look at the world. It's in such a special way. You're bringing a different view. And so that was, for me, kind of restoring my faith that maybe I was chosen for this, actually.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi. I've been working with returning soldiers and Iraqi and Syrian refugees since about 2007, and both communities suffer from extreme PTSD. And one of the things I've learned is the term PTSD is really an inaccurate term. It's post-traumatic stress that is a result of a real human trauma. Yeah. And whether it's war or sexual abuse or whatever it is, it's not a disorder. And we have to stop treating it like a disorder. The other thing I'd like to say, it's about the soldiers. What often happens is returning soldiers need to receive disability benefits. And so they go to the VA and they have to prove how serious their problems are. And so they might spend 6 or 30 visits with a counselor proving how crazy and fucked up they are.
Yeah.
And so that conversation comes from probably hundreds of conversations in their own heads, convincing themselves how damaged they are. And so whether they receive benefits or not, it still makes those grooves in the record deeper and deeper, and so it's even harder to come out. So.
Yeah.
Great comments.
I want to just jump in really quick if I can. I'm with you that PTSD is tricky. I don't actually like what it stands for. And in my life, I have sort of reframed that as persistent toxic stress environment.
Yeah.
That's where I was formed. I was formed in this persistent toxic stress that I still deal with. So you're right, it's not a disorder. It's like the layer of trauma that we build our lives on. It's like a foundation for some of us.
Yeah.
So I'm a mom. My daughter, when she was 16, had multiple suicide attempts. Today she's 21, living a healthy life. She got really a great treatment program and a lot of great support in her life, and she's found a lot of great healing. And one of the things that resonated, Sheila, was that you said we need to be teaching in the schools, early childhood, supporting families with young children, and the aspect of emotion regulation and those thinking skills, those brain skills, and our ability to develop a healthy relationship with ourselves and others
Right.
is supported throughout our entire life and in every relationship.
Right.
So trauma plays a role in maybe there being a predisposition, but a trauma then becomes that second hit that really kicks severe illness into gear. And just wanted to kind of see if you guys want to speak to how can we get more emotion regulation and supports in the workplace and in the schools and in our families. It's really everywhere. It's not just one place.
It's such a wonderful point, and I'm always aghast when I see us cutting things like art and recess and all of the things that are the basic building blocks for children to be able to offload stress. I really think that the young people, Sophie's age, are going to change the paradigm around this. They have grown up being more in touch with their emotions. They will begin having children soon. They'll be in their early to late 20s and 30s and demand that their kids have a curriculum that includes things like mindfulness, that includes things like art, that teaches them how to self-regulate and begin to identify the parts of the brain and what the brain is capable of doing when it's overreacting or underreacting. And I leave many of the most perplexing questions up to younger advocates because they just don't have the BS that we do. They wouldn't fight funding for this kind of curriculum. Mindful Schools is growing on the West Coast, one of the fastest growing programs, and they will come in for free in schools and teach your kids how to develop a mindfulness approach. And what they're doing with test scores in inner city schools is off the charts. So we have to start looking at data, those things that are working, and start demanding that the people who are in charge of our budgets actually fund them. Great question, by the way, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of Jen's gallery as well, and Jen, shout out to you.
By the way, can we just say we're going to be at Jennifer's gallery on the 24th talking in a small with the Flawless Foundation. So if you would like to see the gallery and be part of a smaller conversation on mental health, please pick up a postcard. Yeah.
So my question is, when you have somebody in your life who has mental illness, how can you help them who doesn't want to be helped?
Well, I definitely went through that. Why don't you go first, since you probably have had the experience on the other side of the coin, where you're not feeling loved, so you don't want love.
I want to position it in kind of a hopeful way for those with the loved one, but unfortunately, I kind of had to hit bottom. I know I can't even imagine what my parents had to experience. But it wasn't until I was willing to learn about my diagnosis. I got diagnosed at 30, but it wasn't until 37 that I actually knew what that meant and needed to make changes in my life. And, I think that the best thing is to just be there for the person. Don't try and tell them to snap out of it, or just let them know that you're there. And another thing that really helped me was when I was in that state, everything around me started to crumble. Dirty dishes, laundry, just daily tasks. And it was really helpful to have somebody around me just take care of some of that stuff, so it wasn't, on my plate. And I could start to focus inward and getting healthy.
Another question here? Yeah.
Thank you for all your sharing. I had a question, but I wanted to say I am a pastor of a church, United Church of Christ, and we are open and affirming. But because of a member of our church coming forward to me saying we need to do a mental health ministry, she has really been the driving force. Since that happened, we've had like a whole crumbling, a lot of people coming out with their mental illness. One thing I've learned and I'm concerned about is, and I think you mentioned your daughter going to Unity, going to be an apprentice or something at Unity.
She's going to help organize the peer support network.
And that's the new program that's going to open in the fall?
It's a psychiatric emergency care center
Right.
that's a collaboration of 5 hospitals here, and it will be trauma informed, and there will be a peer support person, which for those of you that don't know is a person who has lived experience, who's suffered and who's gone through and is now through that crisis, and they can say, I know what you're going through and you're going to get through this. It's a really important piece of that center.
Yeah, my question too is I had found out through the grapevine that it's actually because of that center, the hospitals involved are going to close their psych units, and there'll be less beds available in Portland than there are now, which is a very scary thing, and I don't know for sure if it's fact. But if you have any input or any pressure to put on anyone, we need to go to the mayor or somebody, because we don't have enough psych beds at all, and so this is lessening that.
Yeah. I do know part of the idea is a strategy around less time in a hospital with other people who are really sick, more time transitioning you back into a home where you can receive care and support from your loved ones, to provider networks like Trillium, who will provide immediate therapy and the person who can actually take you to the next steps. My experience of watching my husband in a hospital, and I know Unity is attempting to be different, is that he believed he was going to be like everyone else. He saw people who were really, really sick and said, this is me, this is my story, this is how it ends. And I think there's a shifting away from that. I was just at the American Association of Suicidology conference in Chicago, and Marsha Linehan, who actually was the founder of dialectical behavioral therapy, believes that we shouldn't have inpatient beds. She says there's no data to show that people improve when they're actually in that kind of care center, because she believes it's so important to get the person moved to normalcy, moved into an atmosphere where they can actually be supported. And, I have mixed feelings about it, because I know when my husband was at his worst, I would have hated to try to actually take care of him any longer. But what happened to him was so disastrous that I do see her point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A few others here. Go ahead.
I'm actually one of those peer support specialists that you speak about.
Woo! Way to go!
The cheers isn't quite yet. I've been through a very maddening process trying to get into the field. It's extremely difficult. And there's more people joining this field every single day, which is great, but we don't have the infrastructure to be able to support that. I went through 3 different interviews and still didn't get a peer support position in the position I was going through, because these 3 different agencies were still trying to talk to each other, and it was just a very maddening process.
Yeah.
And I believe in peer support. I believe that the threads of our stories are the tapestry of our very livelihood, and that we can see the empower enrichment of our mental illness to mental wellness. And I believe in that. And so I know Jennifer's creating a gallery for people to show their work towards. I want to know what each of you are doing to support peer support services as a whole.
Yeah.
Truly.
Look at Logan. So we're doing a lot, and Trillium actually is going to be part of the Unity process, specifically around peer support. The idea that we're having these innovations in the midst of a totally broken system, and that the innovations are supposed to somehow fix the system, is, I think, a very hopeful step forward. But at the end of the day, I mean, we need to change things on a national level in order for the programs and these innovations to really take hold. And I think we're doing that. I mean, I think things are happening all at once. I think it helps for people like you to stand up and tell your story about what it even means, right? And I have a bitterness around specifically the funding of children's mental health across the board. Children are usually thought of as an afterthought, frankly. When we're building big, new, fancy buildings, we're lucky if we get a wing, right? And so really moving healthcare upstream, whether it's through peer support, whether it's through emotional intelligence training early on, any of those things, they're all pieces of the puzzle that get us there. So what I'm doing personally is I'm a chief at an organization that really believes in trauma-informed care, believes in the fact that there's, at any given time in Oregon, 139,000 children experiencing a mental health crisis. And I mean, we have like 72 beds personally. So there's never going to be enough capacity to meet the need, but we're sure going to try.
I'm very curious if you have reached out to Folk Time, which is providing one of the biggest training grounds. They're the most organized around peer support. Do you know about that organization?
So the difficulty isn't the training, it's actually getting the placement in the positions. So we have a huge influx of individuals that have the certification, but we don't have enough jobs out there. And so there's two tiers. And then another issue with the whole program is they're actually trying to rework it, so you have to go back into the archives to prove that you have the certification. And so it's a very new kind of idea, but I feel like it's the core of providing mental wellness, because we may not have degrees, us that have experienced these debilitating conditions, but we are experts by experience, and we have maybe 30 years of experience living with these conditions and these states and overcoming them, and that's our testament.
I agree. I'll say two things. I have been one of the largest supporters of this behavioral health center, and I know the new director, and I am holding her feet to the fire that peer support is actually implemented there. And then secondly, I would just say that even though you may not land this summer in a paid job, your role as a person who could help so many other people who are suffering is so enormous. And so I hope that you continue to provide that kind of support and care, because I would have given anything to meet a person like you when my husband was ill, anything. I thought that people who were mentally ill stayed mentally ill, and the doctors didn't help me believe otherwise. So thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Fasa Sishu. I am from Ethiopia. Excuse me. I am from Ethiopia. After came to the United States in 1985. After a beautiful 3 years, I started experiencing mental issue, depression, and in 2009, I took medication, clinical research. Then I didn't get any help, and I started understanding that is a culture. It's a cultural issue for me, and I started using meditation and prayer and different techniques, and which really helped me for over 22 years without any medication to balance my life and live. And today, when I hear about the stigma and what I went through, and and what you guys are doing here is so helpful, and thank you very much. For the last 2 months, I started carrying with my bag.
Yeah.
I am hoping like a day I can meet at least 3 people and tell them there is hope and there is way to live with it. It's not easy, but thank you. There will be way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amen to that. How are we doing here in time? Is everybody watching this? What? Okay. About 5 minutes. Any other questions? Sure.
Hi, my name is Martin. I'm a peer support specialist for one of the mental health agencies. I'm also October Moore's mom.
Oh.
So, Logan, I want to talk
So
to you
great.
after. Now that I'm up here, because I'm a consumer, so I have questions based on being a consumer, being being bipolar myself. But you know what? I don't know if I even know what to say that would be valuable.
Well,
or
you
ask.
could say just briefly how you got to be a
Oh,
peer
peer
support
support
specialist,
specialist?
since we just had someone who wants to know.
I'm
Yeah.
a peer support specialist at the agency I used to receive my services from. And for a while, I was both a client and an employee. And now I'm just an employee there.
Well, just tell us how you got the job.
How I got the job, they kind of wooed me. They wooed me. I had a counselor that recommended me to the director, and the director, I didn't want to do it. I was like, and they, around me, saw me with the other clients and said, you'd be great at this. They paid for me to do the training, and that's how I do it. But man, it's not easy. It's not easy because I have my own illness, and just because I'm managing it, there's times when I have to not work.
Yeah.
And luckily, working at a mental health agency where I'm also, so long-term diagnosed, which I didn't get diagnosed properly till I was 50. Also, depression, and they just thought I was hyper all the time. So antidepressants kicks you into mania, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, I won't stay up here because this is really interesting. I'm coming from maybe a 2-week manic episode, and the timing of this was like, oh, I can't go to that. And meds adjusting and things like that. So I'm really excited about all these new programs. And I'm going to find out more about them because I might want to jump ship.
That's so
Thanks
wonderful.
for sharing.
Thank you.
There's, I think, one more, and we'll. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm 24, and I was diagnosed when I was 19 with bipolar type 1. I'm a friend of Jen's, and we actually met in a support group. But my question is about the recovery journey. I haven't had an episode for 4 years, and in a lot of ways, sometimes I feel like a fraud, or like my recovery journey has been lucky, and that's what my family, I think, is how they view it. And sometimes I feel like you're waiting for the next episode or the next crisis. And I guess my question, as I'm entering the professional field, and you're all professionals in your respective fields, is how you can speak your truth, as you've already said, remain true to yourself, identify as someone with a mental illness, but also be successful and sort of reach your full potential while staying healthy and honest, I guess, with yourself.
That's great. Well, Jennifer, why don't you talk about that for a second?
Well, I was in the corporate world for 12 years, and I really, at that point, just shoved my diagnosis aside, and it eventually caught up to me. And I think, what's made me able to have a profession now and maintain mental health is, as you said, honest. Just be honest with yourself. If your body is telling you it needs to rest, allow yourself to rest. If you're, I think, the holistic process again, maybe not just 100% work, but allow yourself to find time to take care of yourself, whether it's coloring books or music or writing, and just really do your best to balance yourself and allow yourself that space to maintain a healthy life.
But what about being honest about the diagnosis at work?
So I think, my standpoint is it's really important. It was a huge breakthrough for myself and my own personal stigma to admit that I was bipolar. Unfortunately, I felt the stigma. I had the repercussions, and I was excused from my role, which was devastating at the time. But in a lot of ways, I don't regret it because A, it brought me to here, but also I can say, I'm bipolar. It's okay, and I don't feel ashamed of it anymore. So on one hand, I guess choose the right people to confide in as best you can, but also, if it just wasn't, I guess in hindsight, I now see it wasn't the right fit. As hard as it was to leave that, it obviously wasn't the right fit if that was the response I was going to get.
I've actually had conversations with lawyers who deal just with mental health and disability, and they say you are in a much more protected place if you tell your human resources person from the beginning. And so don't get hired with a disability, but soon after talk about your bipolar disorder or your depression or your anxiety, because if something happens and you actually do need time off, you'll be protected in a way that you're not if you come around and hope to get in the back door with it. So it's important, just as a civil rights issue, that you actually disclose, but do it with only the people who have the highest degree of confidence.
Can I just add one thing, just bouncing off what you said? I heard you say you're lucky and that your family perceives you as lucky, which is totally awesome. But I think sometimes in times where I'm feeling really successful, or I'm tracking, or I'm getting up and I'm having all this stuff that I want to have happen to me, there's a feeling of being invisible in my own suffering then, right? Because it's not I'm not visibly presenting as depressed or as anxious or whatever, that suddenly my diagnosis or my claim to my space in the world gets taken from me. And I think it's really important to not ever let anybody take that from you. You know what you've gone through, you know who you are, and you should be celebrated for being successful in that.
Yeah, I want to say one thing too, because just what you said, we all feel like a fraud sometimes. I mean, that's just normal, right? So that shouldn't feel weird. It's a part of, being an adult. So. Anyway, all right. I think, are we good? Are we done? What do we got? Yes.
Can we hear it for Ben Carey? Yeah. Thank you, Ben. That was amazing.
Thank you all for coming. I just want to tell you, Sheila's going to be signing her book just outside if you want to stick around. Logan's releasing his album in September, and Jennifer's gallery is just over here at 9th and Everett. Thank you all for coming.
Go sign up for Keep Oregon Well, just right outside.
Is J. Pepin Gallery?
J. Pepin Art Gallery.
Thank you all.